Hello, History and Heritage Explorers. In this next series of videos, we're going to be exploring some of the historic sites of the American Civil War. So please sit back and enjoy. Hello, boys and girls. Welcome to History and Heritage Explorers. Today we are in Baldwyn, Mississippi at the site of a major Civil War battle called Brice's Crossroads. So please sit back and enjoy while we learn about the history of this battle.
Okay.
All right, History and Heritage Explorers. Today I'm being joined with Elliott Witt. He is a high school teacher and a archaeological
major and historian. I had two majors at Ole Miss, University of Mississippi here in Mississippi. I got a bachelor's in history, a master's in archaeology and history. So there it is. Yeah.
All right, and
almost done with my master's, but not yet.
And Mr. Elliott is going to explain to us what happened here at the Brice Crossroads.
Of course. All right. In June 10th, 1864, one of the most one-sided victories of the American Civil War, the war between the states, whatever your historian preference is, took place on this ground on the small town of Baldwyn. Some people call it, the Union actually call it the Battle of Guntown, because Guntown is directly behind the camera, and there's a crossroads. Where that red Jeep four-wheel drive is coming through, that's Guntown. Straight through would be New Albany. Where that black car is going is Ripley, and directly behind us is the road to Baldwyn. Now, on the early morning of June 10th, 1864, it was hotter than the day. That's what I always try to think about, wearing an all-wool uniform, 2 or 3 layers, carrying about 50 pounds on your back, a 20-pound rifle with water ammunition. Imagine marching 9 miles in this heat to go to battle. Not many people could take it. Men were different back then, I guess. But General Forrest sent his corps up, his cavalry corps, up the Brice's Crossroad, headed toward Guntown. The original intent was that they knew or had an anticipation, or their strategy was to meet the Union Army under General Sturgis at the Battle of Tupelo, what they called Harrisburg. Unfortunately, Sturgis was a couple of days ahead, and they had a conflict here at the Battle of Brice's Crossroad. About 5 miles down the road, past the cemetery, was when the Confederates and Union troops first made contact. Confederate cavalry and Union skirmishers made contact. General Forrest was well behind the rear. As I said, he wasn't anticipating a major campaign here. He was anticipating about 30 or 40 miles due west of here. He heard the battles, and later on in this video, I will show you where General Forrest came out of the wood line onto a trail where he met his command, got his staff in line, got his army organized, and he prepared to fight an army more than 4 times his strength. Sturgis had about 8,500 people. General Forrest had a little over 3,000. So 800, 5,000 people versus 3,000. I mean, most people would think that'd be a one-sided, but this became one of the most one-sided upsets in any battle on American soil, especially in the American war the war between the states. And because it was, General Forrest was the first general, the first military tactician that we know about. Even West Point today, the military academy, teaches about General Forrest's foot cavalry. He would move his unit fast and hard on horses. When he met the enemy, he would have the fourth, is what they called him. The fourth person behind the lead horse would hold 4 horses. The 3 in front would go over to an area and form a line or a foot cavalry regiment. Then he would get his line in order, like infantry, and then they would engage with the enemy, where General Forrest and his adjutants and his officers would encourage, or where they ordered. That was one of the real reasons why he upset Sturgis here. He got here way before Sturgis. When Sturgis had a courier that said Forrest was already at the Brice's Crossroads, or at the crossroads, they said, he made his infantry. Now, infantry is the most important part of any engagement. Cavalry is very good, it's very fast, it's supposed to be shock troops, but infantry is your bread and butter. Sturgis made his infantry double quick, miles down the road behind you, to meet General Forrest's foot cavalry. Like I said a while ago, it was a lot harder than what it is now. Imagine running about 8 miles with 3 layers of wool on you, say 100 pounds of gear on you. When you got to your destination, you were not going to be well rested. You were going to be fatigued. your mind's gonna be playing tricks on you, and with that, you're gonna have low morale. So within just a few minutes, Sturgis's infantry bent like a coat hanger. General Forrest broke through. It got pushed back. The entire time of the battle, the Union was on the run. The entire time. General Sturgis was trying to rally his men, his officers were trying to rally his men, but from heat exhaustion, just pure shock of what the Confederate foot cavalry did, there was never really a positive side for the Union Army here, unfortunately. And when they got to the crossroads behind you, General Forrest set up after his cavalry secured the area, if you look right across the road of that monument, his artillery was set there firing upon the retreating Union down this other road going towards Ripley. It was there at that monument that the first recorded artillery charge was ever happened. And he didn't have horses. He didn't let his wagons pull it. His artillery crew were ordered to run and push that that artillery piece as fast and as hard as it could to a ridge you'll see later on. And on top of that ridge, one of the most horrendous artillery barrages in the history of warfare happened on a much superior number of Union force who was scattered en route, terrified, morale was low, and they actually thought the entire time they were fighting a Confederate force more than twice their size. But the fact that General Forrest was so well trained and his men were so well trained in shock troops and foot cavalry, they were able to move all around the battlefield very fast with horses, dismounting horses, hiding the horses in the trees. And when the Union saw that, they thought it was another brigade, another regiment, another company reinforcing the Confederates. So it was just a shock. Another story about General Forrest, he actually had, not this battle, but he actually tricked an entire Union command to surrender to him with over three times less than men. And how he did it was, he had about 4 cannons, 4 artillery pieces, but he ordered them on wagon and tracks to circle the Union Army as much as they could. Then told sections and squads of his cavalry to circle the Union Army. So when the Union Army saw them, they kept thinking it was reinforcements. Well, the general in charge of the Union forces finally called for a parley. He met General Forrest, and General Forrest still had his men running with the wagons, had his wagons and artillery going back and forth. It's on record that Union General said, "My God, man, how many cannons do you have?" And General Forrest jokingly said, 15 is the only amount that could keep up. He said, 15? I've only got 5. He said, well, I'm sorry. And his men were going back and forth. He said, my God, man, how many infantry you have? He said, I have over 10,000 that I've seen. So they had an agreement. The Union officer did not want his army destroyed, did not want to be humiliated with a defeat and surrender during a battle. So he offered terms to surrender his entire army if General Forrest would parole him. Now, they didn't see much time in a Union prisoner of war, or Confederate prisoner of war camp because of the parole. But when General Forrest told him the truth, the Union general was so mad, he asked for his sword back, and they said that this was unfair and the ethics of war. And General Forrest replied, all is fair in love and war. Sorry. But that's a quick thing about General Forrest. But this monument was erected by the Department of Interior to commemorate the battle, in memory of the men of Confederate and Federal armies that took part in this battle at Brice's Crossroads, or Tishomingo Creek, as the Confederates called it, June 10th, 1864, which resulted in a victory for the Confederate forces under Brigadier General Nathan Bedford Forrest. Now, behind us is a map. It's the oldest map here at Brice's Crossroads. It shows it. Now, I'm gonna tell you why these two armies met here. It wasn't by chance. Just months before this battle occurred, General Forrest had orders and intentions to trail General Sherman on his march to Atlanta to cut his supply lines, his communication lines. Well, Sherman wasn't no general that was just promoted the day before. He was a seasoned veteran. He ordered General Sturgis to leave Memphis and to attack General Forrest in Tupelo or the surrounding area to keep Forrest in North Mississippi, so that General Sherman's march to Atlanta and the sea would be uninterrupted. Unfortunately, Sturgis got here. Sturgis boasted about how he was the one that killed the Devil Forrest. General Sherman replied, I don't care if it takes 10,000 men or the entire treasury of the United States government. I want that Devil Forrest killed. Sturgis got here. He underestimated Forrest's tacticians. He underestimated his foot cavalry. The rest took his place. We're at the Crossroads right here. The monument is right here, and this monument is where the Brice house stood. The Brice plantation, the house was here, and it was actually used as a field hospital, first by the Union Army, then by the Confederate, and after the battle, both Union and Confederate wounded were in there. Unfortunately, a couple years after the battle, the house burnt, but this monument was erected to not only solidify and pay tribute to all these heroes on both sides that fought, but also to mark the place where the Brice Hospital stood that saved many lives. From Ripley, the Union Army came. From Baldwyn, the Confederate Army came. This area right here down the road is where skirmishers of the Union Cavalry and General Forrest's cavalry met. They were on foot, so the scouts actually ran back and reported there was Confederate infantry up the road. Sturgis, as I said a while ago, freaked out and said, supposedly said to his staff, we got beat, double quick the infantry. So down the road from New Albany and Ripley, he double-quicked his infantry. That was a very big blunder for General Sturgis. You have to take care of your infantry, especially in a battle against cavalry. If you've got cavalry and infantry against a cavalry unit, victory is sure to be yours. But you have to be smart. General Sturgis was not a very smart tactician. Unfortunately, like a lot of generals in the war between the states, the American Civil War, they were prominent citizens or politicians before the war, and because of that, they were given field commands with no field command experience. General Sturgis was one of those. He thought the superior numbers and the might of the industry of the United States would overwhelm Forrest in a few minutes. And he had a letter already composed to send to General Sherman acknowledging his victory. Let's just say that that letter's never been heard of since. But when the Cav Scouts run back or retreated back, fell back to the agents, Sturgis's agents, they reported cavalry. General Forrest, at this point, split his cavalry corps into 4 units and put them on groups to make it look like 4 divisions of infantry. Now, in the woods back here, every 4th person, from the lead troop, for the lead horse, the 2nd, the 3rd, the 4th would dismount, hold the reins of the horses deep in the woods, and the entire, the rest of the cavalry unit that were not holding horses in the woods would form up like an infantry brigade, 2 to 3 to 4 lines deep. Close ranks. So when they came out of the woods, this entire area was blackjack woods, hardwoods, and pines. Unfortunately, now we have a lot of open ground for historical purposes, reenactments. Put your mind in 1864, June 10th. This area around us was solid woods. It was so solid that there is a private from the 4th Iowa who's at the museum. His diary pieces at the museum, up the road, Mississippi Final Stand. And he talks about how his patrol was marching towards the Confederate enemy. He heard limbs and racket behind him, thought it was his own men. He turned around, and deep in the woods, he saw about 30 or 40 men in gray. That's how thick it was. They were walking on top of each other and didn't know it. And there's actually a lot of charges. General Forrest loved to charge. He loved it. He actually said, I don't care if they have 2,000 and we have 50, we're charging them. He just blazed in surprise. Well, he charged over and over again, and most of the time, it's written in documents, General Forrest's diary, and Reverend Samuel Agnew, who's buried at the cemetery you'll see, he was the reverend at the church you see across from you. Unfortunately, during the battle, the church was on the other side of the road, but he hid his livestock in the woods with himself and left the women here at the Brice house, because back in those days, we knew sometimes through Quantrill's raiders in the Confederacy, General Mosby or General Sherman, that not all the time the women were left alone. So the women were left at Brice house to defend the jewelry, the house, to make sure it doesn't get ransacked. And Reverend Agnew took the livestock deep in the woods. As the whole battle went on, his diary is at the Final Stand's Interpretive Center. You can read every bit of it. And that's where we get a lot of primary sources of the Battle of Brice's Crossroads. He hears from people walking in the woods, his neighbors, his servants coming in. The Yankees got the house. Then the Confederates got the house. General Forrest is on top of it. General Forrest is retreating. It was confusion the entire time because it was so thick. And that General Forrest supposedly had an idea and a foothold on this area. But even General Forrest said in his biography that I had no idea what was going on. I just kept ordering attack after attack after attack. And unfortunately, he said divine providence showed the way. But this right here was the 7th Tennessee Cavalry, his shock troops. As these three divisions of foot cavalry now turned into infantry, slowly but surely marched through the thicket of Brice's Crossroads, and with the Union already being fatigued, they had no idea, they didn't have a grasp on how much Confederates were in front of them, how big of a unit it was, and because of his dismount and his artillery barrages, they actually thought the entire time they were fighting an army 2 times their size. So they would hold, fall back, hold, fall back, hold, fall back. When they reached the Tishomingo Bridge, which you will see later, that's where the rout took place. The Tishomingo Bridge was reconstructed here a few years back, the same dimensions, everything. It's in the exact same spot, according to where Reverend Brice and Mr. Witt, with the White House you'll see in a few minutes, who took care of wounded soldiers on the route, said the bridge was. The charging artillery will come into play with that. General Morton was Captain Morton, was ordered by General Forrest to charge his artillery to the ridge you'll see in a minute, and fired one of the most horrendous artillery barges in the history of American warfare on a routed, confused, scared Union Army. About 8,000 men tried to cross that bridge at one time with wagons and supplies. The stream, the creek, was a lot higher than it was today. The current was very strong. So numerous Union soldiers and some Confederates chasing after them drowned in the creek trying to retreat. General Sturgis was then figured out that he left the battlefield. Some of his aides said he was under the influence of alcohol. Some said he was just so scared and embarrassed by the defeat, he abandoned his troops. That's something a general is not supposed to do, especially a well-trained general. But unfortunately, he was one of those very wealthy citizens who was given a field commission because of who they were. He left, went back to Ripley. Now, we're going to see a spot in a minute. The 55th and 59th Colored Troops made a stand against the Confederate cavalry, or foot cavalry at the time, and it saved the Union Army from complete annihilation. And those are the unsung heroes of this battle. The 55th and 59th Colored Troops. Their job was to guard the wagons and the reserves. When they saw multitudes and multitudes of Union soldiers and cavalry running for their lives, screaming at them, "Get out of here, get out of here, the Rebs are coming," they bravely took a stand, formed 2 divisions, and waited on the Confederate onslaught to come to them. Now, the Confederates were in full scare mode, as General Forrest would say. Put the scare on them, keep the scare on them. He was trying to say scare. Put the scare on them. So the Confederate attackers were not organized. They were not in uniformity, they were just going. They saw an army on the run, they just went every man for themselves, they went after them. But when they came around the corner, which you'll see down the road in a minute, they ran into 2 very disciplined, formed regiments of colored troops. And they fired volley after volley after volley, actually forcing the Confederates back for a short time until the rest of Forrest's corps came to reorganize and charged the 55th and 59th regiment, colored regiment. They almost sustained 100% casualties because of it. They were outnumbered. But those 2 units are the unsung heroes here. The men who fought at Brice's Crossroads on both sides, they're heroes. They both believed and fought for something that they believed in their heart and soul. Some thought it was states' rights, some thought it was for slavery, some of them thought it was for central government getting too big, and a lot of the Union guys thought we were preserving the Union. We don't want this Union that our founding fathers, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Patrick Henry, founded to break apart within 100 years of its existence. But those colored troops, their motivation was freedom. They had their freedom in a United States Union Army soldier's uniform. And they knew that if they fell capture, these Confederates would either sell them back into slavery, put them into servitude, or make them do hard manual labor. So no officer, no white officer gave them the order to make a stand. Nobody pulled their arm, put them at gunpoint to make a stand. They took it upon their patriotic and heroic duties to make a stand against the Confederate advance. And because of that, it saved General Sturgis' army from complete annihilation. After the battle, the Union troop went back to Ripley, burned Ripley to the ground because they were stationed in Ripley, and in Ripley right now we've got a new courthouse. It's because the Union burnt the square in Ripley and all of Ripley to make sure that their supplies, their ammunitions, their hospital gear did not fall into the Confederate hands, who were right on their tail. Because when an army's in full retreat, en route, the Confederate army or any army is going to be right on your tails, because their goal is to annihilate the army, to get you out of the picture, make sure that you're no factor in the war at all. Plus, that losing army, or that routed army, has a lot of ammunition, a lot of food, a lot of medical supplies, a lot of uniforms and boots that the Confederate army at the time really needed. So when the Union Army, or what Rabinow's first part of the Union Army, got back to Ripley, they burned everything so General Forrest could not retrieve and confiscate the supplies that were meant for the Union Army against them. Unfortunately, that he couldn't save their wagon train. There was many wagons that were left behind because the United States colored troops fell back to make a defensive position. Well, after the battle was over with, tons of food, tons of ammunition, tons of uniforms, boots, fresh wagon, fresh horses were now in General Forrest and the Confederates' hands. And at this point in the war, the Confederate treasury was going bankrupt. The government, the central government, was falling apart. The state governments were barely hanging on. It was the currency, the paper money, and the Confederacy had more inflation than what it does today. To buy one loaf of bread, it was $100. That's actually why in Richmond they had the bread riots. And not many Confederates and family members around the South had gold and silver. So that was a big plus for General Forrest. And at the later stages of the war, that's really how a lot, if not all, Confederate units, armies, squadrons, cavalry, artillery survived so long, because they had to capture enemy supplies, because it would take them weeks, months, even if they could get them from Richmond, Montgomery, Memphis, any place that wasn't occupied in the South by the Union Army. And as I said, the central government was falling apart. The Ordnance Secretary, the Health and Commerce Secretary had no means of transporting food to army, because people always think, or maybe first people in American Civil War historians always think that the war was in Virginia because of General Lee, Abraham Lincoln, General Grant, General McClellan, General Stonewall Jackson. But the Confederacy was all the way from Texas to Virginia, from Virginia to Florida. There was armies all across the South. And at the beginning of the war, they had a perimeter defense. President Jefferson Davis believed that if we put small units around the borders of the South, we could slowly but surely hold back the Union Army for all the states in the South to come together as one Confederacy to put all the resources together to attack. Unfortunately, that didn't work. President Davis didn't intend on his raw recruits to collapse so fast, and he didn't put into thought, or he did, but he didn't put really into full comprehension of the might of the United States industry and its manpower. So, over the war, the Union Army slowly came into the South. General Forrest was a part of the Army of Tennessee. Their duty was to protect Tennessee, Mississippi, Alabama, Kentucky, anywhere east of the Mississippi that doesn't go under Georgia or South Carolina or North Carolina. They had one of the hardest times of the war because they were not as well supplied as General Lee's Army of the Northern Virginia. It was right at Richmond, had all the central government. The breadbasket of the Confederacy was at the Shenandoah Valley in Virginia. So General Forrest, General Johnson, General Bragg, General Holmes, almost all of the Army of Tennessee had to survive for 4 long years on captured Union goods. And also, unfortunately, going home to home and confiscating their own Confederate families. This newly formed Confederate government went to their citizens and demanded that their pork, their beef, their grain, everything was turned over for the prosperity and the good of the Army. Now, I don't know many Southerners that would support the Confederacy very long if they worked their hearts out to provide enough grain and stock for money, and also enough grain and stock to support their family. Because not only the Confederates, but the Union Army would come by at these families and take everything. But as I was saying, I digress. That was a little preview of the battle. But this battle right here on this map, and what you'll see across the cemetery and other parts of the battlefield, you really get a sense of how one-sided this was. And some historians call it the genius of Nathan Bedford Forrest. Some historians call it luck. I think it's a mixture of both. And the stupidity and the lack of experience, that'd be a better professional, of General Sturgis. And plus, his ego was so big because he already knew he was going to kill Forrest and deliver that news to Sherman. Maybe if he would have done a little more pre-battle strategy and probably sending scouts to get the lay of the land instead of writing his letter to Sherman prematurely, who knows how this would have turned out. But try to keep in your mind what it was like here. When you walk around, try to think of yourself in June 10th, 1864. Imagine the trees, imagine the guns, imagine the smoke, imagine the chaos of what it must have been like for these men in blue and gray in such a thick terrain and on this hollowed ground.
History and Heritage Explorers would like to give a special thank you to Mr. Elliott Witt for his assistance in making this video. Remember, boys and girls, if you'd like to learn more about the U.S. Civil War, please go to your local and school library. There are many books available. Please like and subscribe and share this video, and thank you from History and Heritage Explorers.